It's too bad that you don't listen to cereal, because I was going to make all these cereal in jokes at the beginning.
I do eat a lot of breakfast cereal.
Yeah? Is it the same thing?
I don't know, because I haven't listened to it.
It has actually no relation to it. There's a great Funny or Die about the last cereal episode.
Oh, yeah.
Which just, if you are like one of the 5 people like Andrew who don't listen to cereal, that just aired today about Sarah Koenig like losing her mind because she just couldn't figure out who did it, and so there was no ending. And so
I thought didn't they say whether the person did it or not?
I'm not going to tell you.
Oh.
You have to listen to all 12
I
episodes.
wanted to listen to it, but then it just became such a huge thing, and I already had like so many podcasts that I listened to. I just couldn't fit in my busy podcast schedule.
You can't commit. You've got commitment issues.
Yeah.
It's really. There's gonna be a whole collect call from. It's not gonna happen. Anyway, we're back.
We're back. Yes, it's been a while.
It's been
a while.
We're old now. I'm actually 80, 85.
Yeah,
We've
26.
lived our lives. Oh wow, you're aging
yeah,
backwards.
I was young when we started.
Oh
this.
yeah, you were like 12.
Yeah.
It was really a little awkward.
Oh man, it has been. We were thinking it's been like 4 months since we've done one. And I think we email each other or text each other every week being like, hey, man, sorry, can't do it.
That's right.
Week.
We suck. Yeah, we have a baby now. Did we have a baby last time?
No, you did. I mean, you and me have a baby?
Yeah, we did.
Is this what you're telling me?
That's right.
Oh, I'm
we
so
did.
excited.
It was your baby, Andrew.
Yes, there's a beautiful new baby in this house.
I know.
Mitch's house.
That's right.
Met her for the first
right
time.
Above us.
Wonderful.
I know. She's a great baby.
She's amazing.
I had to keep her away from you till now, till she was mature enough to handle you.
We had a baby. We also had a little thing called Ebola.
Oh, yeah.
Happen, which kind of sidetracked us. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later.
That's right. We will. And we'll have 2 other stories today. We're going to focus on disaster stories. Loma Prieta.
Thank you, Google Voice, for telling us how to pronounce that.
And the Sony Cyberattack. Everybody wants to, even if Aaron Sorkin says you're un-American for listening or reading the emails released by the Sony Cyberattack, we're going to talk about it anyway.
Aaron Sorkin.
I know. Oh, God, that bastard.
Man, I missed it.
the theme song.
Have you noticed in the 4 months that we've been absent, there are now Dukes of Hazzard's commercials on TV?
No.
Not podcast commercials, but the Bo and Luke Duke are doing like a commercial for, I don't know, Viagra or like something. And they're driving the car and like making jumps and stuff. Yeah, it's really funny.
I do really want a Dodge Charger from the 70s.
With a Confederate flag on it.
I don't think
driving around Brooklyn, that'd go over well.
It would be awesome. Yeah, everybody would love that. Here's the
thing. I
just
want a car with doors welded shut that I can go through the window.
Right, because that's how you keep fit. Like as we get old, we need exercise routines, and what's better than jumping through the window?
Yeah, wearing skinny jeans. I mean, most of the stuff is skinny jeans. You got like a belt clip, something on your belt.
Did we get a flaming crossbow out of this deal? Because if so, awesome.
No, Mitch, they didn't use crossbows. They used actual bows.
Oh,
compound bows.
Oh, sorry. Sorry, that my bow lore is not what it should be. Here's the thing about Ebola. Everybody wants to talk about Ebola. We get like a dozen emails a day. People are calling on the streets. They're like, please, Dukes,
I can't even walk down the street without someone being like, oh, please, when's the podcast coming back?
Yeah,
please talk about Ebola. I'm like, guys, come on. I have a life.
And the thing is, we can't talk about Ebola. Or we can
kind of.
We can talk about Ebola sort of, but we can't talk about New York City Ebola, which is where a lot of what happened in the past couple of months,
which is really unfortunate.
I know it is, because we could say things, but we can't, because we work in New York City. We're citizens of New York City, and so it's just not a thing.
Yeah, and maybe sometime we can talk about employers and their embrace of social media in a general way. I think that would be an interesting conversation. Like,
sure,
like some big employers aren't quite comfortable with, employees doing podcasts or even tweeting or there's a line there that used to be pretty clear, like work life and now social life, and that's blurred.
Right.
So a lot of people will have like who they work for on their Twitter feed or Facebook, or I kind of try to keep that separate. Yeah. And so you don't hear me talking a lot on this podcast about like, or any podcast, because this is the only podcast I do, about like...
You have another podcast?
Oh, you cheater!
You're betraying me with another secret podcast?
You don't
it's
hear
not
me,
your baby.
Right. You don't hear me talking about work much. I think I could say the same for you, right?
Right.
And it's because we're not too comfortable with sharing that side of us.
We are sworn to secrecy.
Sworn to
by a vested trust. You know what we should do is have Jim back on the podcast to talk about this stuff.
That would be really good.
You know, I think he could break it down.
Because he is very open with who he works for, where he works,
yep,
what he does. So maybe we could take some lessons from him.
So we're going to talk about what we can talk about with Ebola.
Yep.
Which is, I think, pretty good. We're gonna really lay out specifically some elements of it. We're gonna really dig in behind the scene to some of the West Africa stuff, which is where the meat of it is anyway, and where I would much rather have people's attention focused than the United States stuff, either the current stuff or the historical stuff.
That's a great point. Yeah. So just starting off, there's a few stats about Liberia that we found that are pretty interesting. We'll post these online, but there were only 200 doctors in Liberia before the outbreak, and most of those left as soon as the outbreak happened. So you had a massive kind of a lot of healthcare professionals leaving the country. 25% of Liberians don't have access to clean water, which just exasperates diseases like this. 49% of the people spend most of their income on food, and it's the fourth poorest country in the world. And then on March 21st, 2014, a 35-year-old woman from the northern town of Foya, I think that's how you say that, and it's on the border of Guinea and Sierra Leone, became the outbreak's first victim in Liberia. And she's the country's patient zero.
So we have this. So let's just set the scene. We're going to tell the story of Ebola in Liberia a little bit. So we have that as a baseline, right? And so that's like one physician for every 100,000 people that are actually working in public health stuff. We don't have, in the United States, there's been all this stuff about PPE, and people are wearing powered air purifiers, and they're covered head to toe. Right. And I get the feeling, like, if I'm in West Africa, I would just be like, you assholes.
Yeah,
Sorry,
right.
Explicitly. In America, because we're treating everything with that level of, that's like $30,000 an outfit or whatever for these things. And they've got none of that. They have none of that at all. And so the thing I want to break down is, okay, so that happens in March. So then Liberia tries to build up a response. And so this is a disaster response podcast. So we're going to talk about what we always talk about, which is like the incident command system and what they do.
One thing on that line before we jump into the ICS, it's funny, like I remember when the guy in New York City took the Uber cab, and like went to Brooklyn Bowl, there's all this stuff about, should we not take Uber now? We shouldn't ride. What line was he on? He was on the ad relatives.
Yeah.
And being like, don't take the blue line, which I was like, it's the A train. Don't take, he was on the A train. And, you see this stuff here happening, and then you think about Liberia, what they're going through there. Like, I have a professor from grad school who's working over there. He's got an amazing blog that we'll post up on our website. But, he was like, people don't hug. You don't shake hands.
Yep.
There's hand washing basins out of every public building. There's just, it's completely changed the culture of the country, this disease.
And to one note, it was the gutter in Brooklyn, not Brooklyn Bowl. I just want to make sure.
Oh, was it Brooklyn Bowl?
Yeah, it wasn't Brooklyn Bowl. See, that's an interesting thing about
Brooklyn
social
Bowl.
media, right? Is that it came across because it was a bowling alley in Brooklyn, but it was actually the gutter and not there, which is a good place to bowl. Everybody should bowl at the gutter.
Yeah.
And consider sponsoring podcast.
They'll probably get a bump after this podcast.
Absolutely.
The hazards bump.
The hazards bump.
That every
since the Colbert
product
bump
we mentioned gets
is going away. Tonight is the last Colbert episode. That's when we're recording this.
Yeah.
I hope we get both the serial ratings and the Colbert Report ratings.
We should have him on the podcast.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
I don't think he's doing anything right now.
All right. So it's May in Liberia. So they've had their index case. They've seen what's happened in other nearby countries. They've seen how Guinea is going. So what do? So inside of Liberia, really to get into the weeds, they have a Ministry of Health and Social Welfare. The acronym for that is MOHSW, and I'm not sure how you would say that in acronym speak. Moshu? I don't know. But so what happened there is initially when they got that index case, they saw what was happening in other countries. So they developed a national task force and a technical expert committee to oversee that. So They did that for a couple of months. And then what happened was it started to gain international attention, and something weird happened in CDC, so in the United Nations. So we've talked before about the UN response, like in Haiti and other places, where the UN has this cluster system, right? So there's a humanitarian emergency, and the UN creates clusters like we have emergency support functions in the States, where it's around a subject. So there's a human services cluster. Right?
Water, sanitation, things like that.
Exactly. But in this case, because this was a medical event, the United Nations didn't do that.
Okay.
Because it's different. Because it's like doctory and germy and stuff. Mm-hmm. So they decided, well, that's not right. It's not that thing. So we'll let the medical people handle it. But the thing is that the medical people didn't have a cluster system. It was not, we would say, it was not an all hazards approach to disasters internationally, right? So there's not any kind of general management system that's there. So what CDC does, and there's a great MMWR on this about CDC creating an incident management system. In July, they send a whole team of people into Liberia, and they do like an after-action report kind of, or they do an evaluation of how Liberia is managing the incident. Okay, and they say how much of this is in the weeds here. They say, okay, you guys are doing pretty well, but we want you to do these new things. We want you to have daily briefings, right?
Go sit briefing.
Yeah, we want you to have deputies who are responsible, who's like an incident commander for the entire response. We want you to have depth. Right now, you don't have any depth in your position, so you need to have deputies to take over for you when you have to go rest and have alternate decision-making things. And your span of control is too big because you're having one person connect all these things. So they did all of this stuff.
And these are all ICS items.
Right. This is like, well, it's like two things, right? In my head, I'm sort of like, all right, CDC, go. And then in my other brain, I'm like, mate, really? You know, it's kind of, it's like colonialism, right? They're like colonizing a Liberia response with our incident command structure.
Right.
You know, like, does it fit or does it not fit? I don't know. But anyway, what happened is Liberia listened to them. So at the beginning of August, this Mosho appointed an incident manager who just was responsible for the Ebola response. And they had a 9 a.m. meeting every day, an incident management meeting that established response priorities and objectives for the day. And then they followed through on those objectives, and the next day they looked on how they were fulfilling them. And then what happened is it got really controversial. This response thing did. So, because from us it seems great. The CDC thought it was great, and they sort of said, okay, well, we're going to refine this in the next 6 months, and it's going to be awesome. So what happened was, inside that incident command system, incident management system, there are all these nonprofits who came in. Liberia was in there, CDC was in there, and people started feeling sidelined. They felt like they didn't have enough control, and they started complaining about it. And somebody in there leaked a whole clutch of PowerPoints and emails and stuff from inside the response of people like complaining about each other, which the Times reported in this article a couple of weeks ago, which was fascinating to me, you know, because that's kind of what happens with an incident management system is there is all this sort of infighting, and it's all about how much you kind of control it and sort of hide it from the outside world.
Right.
Maybe that's not the right way to say that.
No, I think, especially as the disaster wanes on, you get tired, you get frustrated, you get sick, especially in a disaster like this. People are literally dying. Stuff like this happens.
But it did say this is exactly ICS in my experience, that, you know, before it the response was chaotic and sort of bogged down, and then after it was not chaotic, it was collegial and effective, but also there was a lot of like showmanship and posturing about things, you know? Like people just were became political, and
people were kind of taking credit for things.
I think so. And also then there were like these logistical issues. People were putting in resource requests that should be available, and they weren't getting fulfilled in time, and people were complaining. The people fulfilling the request were complaining. The people requesting it were both complaining that the other one wasn't doing it right.
Right.
It's like all that stuff.
It's so funny.
We're laughing because like this is like sort of your life in ICS is dealing with this kind of stuff all the time.
And like logistics are always so incredibly important, and it's so hard to get right.
Right. Yeah.
I'm just glad we're not the only ones that struggle with it.
I know. And it was fascinating to me because they are sort of fighting their way through this, right? They feel that putting an incident management system on top of this outbreak is a way to fix it. And the thing I've noticed about when you put an incident management system on top of something is all these problems that were invisible before become visible.
Come to the surface.
Yeah, right? You can suddenly, because you're having a briefing every day, and before you didn't have a chance to bitch about whatever it was, and now you've got a 9 a.m. meeting where you can, you know, but that's sort of the best way to make sure these things are.
It's also a testament to the Liberians who, you know, are going. I know they've had Ebola in their country before, but not to this degree. So they have this huge emergency, and then on top of it, they come in and try to restructure and kind of make more efficient their response system, so that it's almost like two major operations going at the same time. So the fact they were able to do both is really a testament to the people there.
I think that's right, and all credit to CDC and to the UN also, because they kept the structure underneath the Liberian government, which is where it should be. Right? One of the problems with the UN cluster system is it kind of can supplant the national government, and in this case it's not doing that, and that's good too. So you have to kind of toss a coin and you say, well, is it becoming more chaotic because they have this ICS system, or is it more chaotic because they're revealing problems? And the fact is that the outbreak in Liberia is slowing down. You know, they've been much better about contact tracing recently. They've been much better about sort of quarantine and monitoring stuff, and it seems to be kind of plateauing.
Yeah, that's great.
So to me, there's a cause and effect sequence there, in terms of helping it.
Absolutely.
I want to hit one other point. That was a long pause. That might be my longest pause ever.
Like, what's coming
in the
next?
podcast so far.
What other what?
Boom, boom, boom. Which is the bad news. So I'm going to give good news, bad news on Ebola. And
gosh, that was the good news?
That was the good news,
wow.
Right? There's one other piece of good news, although there's like a lot of dead mice first. But the bad news is that when you think about Ebola, we keep thinking of it as an infectious disease outbreak, right? But the problem is the level of death and the doctors that have died and that have left the country have caused these two problems, right? The UN just put out a report that because everybody has been sick and dealing with this, these three countries, Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone, have had no crops. Like, they've lost crops because there have been border closings, there are quarantines, there are hunting bans, there are all of these restrictions, so people can't grow food. And so there are 230,000 people in Guinea, 170,000 in Liberia, 120,000 in Sierra Leone who are really food insecure, who are going into famine, and that those numbers over the winter are going to increase.
Right.
So there's that issue, and then there's the fact that the 11th senior doctor died in Liberia yesterday. So over the course of this, they've lost, of those 50 public health docs they had, half of them left, and now half of those that are remaining are dead. Yeah. And so...
and just kind of as the disease is plateauing, right? It's kind of like just as they get a foothold on this thing, kind of this tidal wave of other problems are coming.
And so, 6,000 people have died, almost 20,000 cases. And it could be that over this winter, because of famine and because now you can't go to a hospital in Liberia and get treated for pneumonia or influenza or any of these other things, the death toll from those effects may actually be higher than the death toll for Ebola itself.
Yeah, I did read about that, and I read that malaria has similar symptoms, and people in a lot of these countries, they'll get malaria, but they don't want to go to the hospital to expose themselves to Ebola. So people are dying from these other diseases like malaria right alongside with the Ebola. It's just, these complex emergencies in these fragile states often cause other problems. Like, I remember in grad school studying about whenever there was civil war, which Liberia hasn't been that long since Liberia came out of a civil war, will cause famine, will cause rapid disease spread. That's just kind of compounded by each other. It's so hard to get ahead in some of these countries.
I think if anybody from the United Nations is listening out there, Ban Ki-moon, I think what those wars led to was the development of the complex humanitarian emergency kind of response procedures.
Mm-hmm.
And in this case, I think what we're seeing is a complex medical emergency where you're seeing these ancillary effects that can kill people coming after the initial emergency. And I think we have to plan for that now. Part of the influenza planning, all the pan-flu planning we've done is looking at how flu can cause infrastructure issues or food security issues. And I think globally, that's something we really got to look at. It's
so hard, too, when, the West's interest starts waning, so the funding starts disappearing.
Yeah.
I mean, even, when the disease isn't spreading as much, that's not the time to pull back. It's almost the time to start pumping in more funds and more doctors so that to try to prevent some of these other major problems from happening.
Yeah, and I really admire CDC. CDC's been under a lot of political pressure, right, the past couple months. And I really admire the stance that they've taken, that supporting West Africa is the best thing we can do to help lock this down, because I think that's helped to keep the media focus on those things.
Tom Frieden's the man. I really like him. He really seems to be doing an awesome job.
I'm going to tell one. I think I can tell this Tom Frieden story.
Yeah, you could.
Which is, the first time in New York City that I ever wrote a sit rep back a few years ago for H1N1. I got this phone call when the sit rep went out. And there's this guy on the other end who's like yelling at me. And he was like, you can't put this stuff in the sit rep. It's too much data. And I was like, well, how can we tell people what's going on in the response? And he was like, somebody could put that out in the media. And it was Dr. Frieden.
So here's my Tom Frieden story. I was working at my computer one late Friday afternoon. I don't actually remember if it was a Friday, but let's stay with Friday because it makes the story better. And I feel this presence behind me. And I turn around. And it's Tom Frieden looking over my shoulder, and he points at my screen and is like, "What's this? What are you working on? What is this?" And I was like, it's like." And thank goodness I actually had a work thing up. I wasn't checking Google at 4 on a Friday, and I was like, it's planning section chiefs scheduling for blah 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 blah. And what do they do? And I explained it a little more, and he's like, "Okay, great, thanks." And he walked out. But he was known for doing that. He would walk around agencies and just drop in on people and be like, "What's this? What are you doing? What is this working on?" So that's Tom.
Okay, so here's the good news. So the goodish news is that you might remember in September, CDC released this modeling for Ebola that said, that we could have 1.4 million cases if there wasn't aggressive interventions that were put out. And that was based on a model that said that up to 250% of the Ebola cases might be unreported because of their model of how Ebola is transmitted, which basically is a model of if you have 4 random people in a room, maybe a couple of them are going to get Ebola because that's how influenza spreads, for example.
Right.
So by looking at the data and sort of recomputing it, Yale this week actually said that it's probably that only 70% or really 20% to 70% about of cases were unreported because Ebola infections were done in social clusters. So they're not random like the flu. They're really clustered around either a neighborhood or a hospital or a burial or something like that. So because they're clustered, they're less infectious, which means that there are probably fewer that are unreported. So that's good because it means there may be light at the end of the tunnel. That maybe the plateaus that we're seeing are actually real and not, some figment of our collective imaginations in West Africa.
That's great.
I think what we should do now is we should just invent fictional Tom Frieden stories. One time I saw him bungee jump off of the new Freedom Tower.
Yeah. I was in the airport in Tokyo, and he came up and slapped me in the face and said, "Nobody will ever believe you," and turned around and walked off.
One time I went to a Rolling Stones concert, and he was playing bass in the background. It was amazing.
He's amazing. He can do everything. Seriously, though, one time I did walk by and saw him in a car, in a Prius, on the phone. So They don't have to be good stories. They can just be any stories.
This one time
at band camp. All right. So next story. No more Tom Frieden stories.
No, we're done.
Mitch and I both saw, and maybe you did too, loyal listeners, a amazing 30 for 30, which is a series that's on ESPN that profiles different sports stories, called About the Day the Series Stopped. And it was about the World Series in 1989, in which Game 4 of the World Series, this was between the San Francisco Giants and the Oakland A's, there was an earthquake. And I actually remember watching this as a kid and seeing this happen, which is pretty amazing. And then this might be the first kind of, maybe this was the birth of my emergency management career, because it was the first disaster, I'm thinking as I say this, that I remember happening. When was the Challenger explosion?
86.
Okay, that was the first disaster I remember happening, but this was the second.
86. That's not right. 84. Sorry.
84. Okay, well, still, that was earlier. So this was October 7th, 89. It was a huge 6.9 earthquake that happened in the middle of the World Series. So if you like emergency management, be sure and check out this really interesting series that goes into the players' reaction, how it affected the World Series, how it affected the towns. Just an amazing show. And
I have a couple clips.
I couldn't think about anything besides going to the game that entire school day.
Home for the Giants.
I love Al Michaels. It's Al Michaels.
Great. Sounds the same.
Any continent. Downtown San Francisco in the background, and we zoom into Candlestick Park. For the first time in 27 years, a World Series game will be played in Candlestick Park.
He had a lot more hair back then.
The Battle of the Bay continues. Game 3 of the 1989 World Series, the Oakland Athletics against the San Francisco Giants.
So the breakdown was what? They were like, it was game, was it game 3? I thought it was
game 4.
It was game 4, right?
Yeah, game 4.
Because they were 2-1. The Giants were down. The A's were up 2 games to the Giants 1 game.
Right, and they ended up sweeping it. And this was a time, too, where Oakland kind of had this, I mean, it still kind of exists. Oakland had this very hardcore, like, gangster. You remember the Oakland hat, kind of side to them. And then San Francisco was, like, the upper crust, high society.
Yeah,
so this is, like, a huge series.
It's hilarious in this 30 for 30, actually. They changed filters in music. So it'll be, like, Oakland, and then it's like gritty and it's like Spike Lee jump cuts, and then it's like
if
San
you're
Francisco.
Going
That's right. And there's like people clinking wine glasses and everything's shot in like lemon yellow. It's ridiculous.
First thing I want to say about this though is that every emergency management agency should do a video like this for every response. It doesn't have to be that in depth, but the way these guys get people who lived through this to just talk in front of the camera about what they remember and what they went through is so powerful.
Yep, and I have a clip for that.
Physically see like a big wave come rolling through the stands. You could physically see it, and when that wave sort of got to me, it almost knocked me off my feet.
All the fans were looking down at us from the second deck, and they were like getting into it. We will, making fun of it. We will rock you.
The gods are on our side. They are. I believe it. We're going to win now. You can't go wrong with an earthquake in San Francisco. The fans, just typical Bay Area people, oh yeah, an earthquake? Okay. And once it stopped, they started chanting, play ball, play ball, play ball.
So there's so many things going on in this clip. I mean, one of the things I remember from the show is, they had to make this decision. Okay, do we stop playing? Do we get the people out of there? But then they started realizing, in fact, there was a blimp up in the air that all the TV channels were down, but for some reason this blimp had the only aerial view of what was going on. And the cops on the ground were like, it's getting reports like it's not that bad. It's not. But this blimp was able to see these fires going in the distance. They were able to see the freeway that had collapsed. And the huge swaths of the city were without electricity. So pretty soon they were like, we got to get these people out of the stadium and get them home before it gets dark. And there's, no way for them to get home. There's no street lights out, no public transportation. And it basically, if I'm remembering correctly, came down to like a cop, maybe a lieutenant or a captain who there at the stadium kind of made the decision, took leadership and talked to the baseball commissioner who was there and made the announcement.
And it shows, we're going to kind of dig into a few different stories about Loma Prieta, right? So that we see the whole thing. And I think that to me, it shows this real discrepancy of it's hard for people to accept when something bad has really happened. Like you're
Right.
gonna hold on to your like exciting go to the game feeling. Like
I'm
way
at the World
past
Series.
reality. Like reality leaves you totally behind.
Right.
I think actually there's a quote from the A's pitcher Westerly. What's his name?
Yeah,
Do you remember Doug Westerly?
I'm a Texas Ranger fan.
Oh
so.
right. So you're not gonna know those Oakland boys.
The difficult part was you're so wrapped up and involved in trying to win something, and then life kicks in, and the world stops. If you think about 1989, it wasn't like cell phones, everybody's kicking, right? No one really was connecting.
Hey, somebody's trying to shake us up. All right, Lord, I heard you.
And I think that's the thing. Even with cell phones and texting, it's just really hard to process this idea that the world is different than it was 3 seconds ago.
Right. Yeah, and especially in a crowd mentality like this, that was
Mm-hmm.
the scary thing about watching this happen is you could tell people were kind of looking around to like, okay, are we going to freak out now? Are we going to cheer? And, when you have a crowd that big, it can just turn on an instant. It could have really, really gotten bad.
Yeah, and the guy I'm kind of citing for my kind of research part of this guy, Sandra Snyder, who actually is female. So I really apologize to all.
Gender neutral,
Yeah.
I think.
Is that really a thing?
Yeah, I think that's.
Oh, okay.
We'll make
Well,
that
we're
rule
gonna just
now.
say that. So, Ms. Guy, Sandra Schneider,
Mm-hmm.
Dr. Schneider, I should say.
Yes, I presume.
Let's all hope so, because otherwise, what am I listening to her for, frankly? But anyway, it lays out this process called milling. That what happens in a disaster, people think that the impact happens and then people run away or whatever. But what they actually do is they mill around to see what other people do.
Yeah.
And so if you're at a game like that and other people are looking around at everybody, but people are still generally excited, people will completely ignore the danger for like several hours.
Right.
While the world sort of burns around them.
In fact, it's funny. The one earthquake you and I have been through together, we kind of did this.
Yeah,
It was
it's the
in New
same
York
thing.
City. There's an earthquake. We all kind of didn't know what to do. We kind of evacuated the building. We were all standing around outside. And it was kind of the same thing. And we all had cell phones, but guess what? Cell phones lines were jammed up. And so we couldn't. And then we did exactly that, right? We all kind of looked around and tried to figure out what to do.
Which is embarrassing for us. Let's just admit that, like,
And
we should have known
Although
better.
I will say, everyone I've talked to who went through that New York City earthquake, this is what, 2010?
Right, and it was like a Virginia earthquake.
It was a
right?
Virginia earthquake that we felt up here. No big deal. But everybody I know went through that, did the wrong thing.
Yeah.
Like they all evacuated the buildings, which we found out later you're not supposed to do.
So fun fact, you ready? East Coast, West Coast have different soil types. So on the East Coast, you have a much more sort of like a clay substrata.
Yeah.
So it means that earthquakes, shaking, travels much farther. So that event, even though it was like a 5 something in Virginia, was felt as far away as Maine. Whereas this event, which was a 6.9, was only felt like 50 or 60 miles away. Yeah, so it's really so that's just something else to add to the eternal East Coast West Coast feud that goes on. Is
We got better soil.
Soil
It travels.
type,
Seismic
what?
waves travel faster. So what else does the doctor say about this?
So here's the breakdown. So let's just first, we're going to look at this in a couple ways. While that's happening in the stadium, while the people in the stadium are still chanting, "We will rock you," and playing Game On, here is what is happening at that same moment out in the rest of the Bay Area.
3283 and units on the bridge. Coast Guard helicopter advises they have reports of injuries.
Total chaos. It's terrible. It's terrible. There's a lot of people under this tent.
The corner of Jefferson and Divisadero, you can see this building is collapsed. They don't know if people are still in there or if they aren't. You can see the fire down past me. What has happened is that the natural gas lines have ruptured, and that is what has caused that fire.
It's been a frightening scene here. As you can see just below me is where this crack in the Bay Bridge occurred, a 50-foot section.
This was once a 4-story apartment building. When we arrived, they were taking out victims.
Yeah, I totally remember this as a kid, seeing these freeways that had just pancaked on each other, and these buildings that had the ground floor had collapsed and were being held up by 2x4s, and it was crazy. But the one thing I do remember even back then is that there were people helping. I mean, there were a couple firemen, policemen, but for the most part, it was like shirtless dudes with mustaches, helping people out. People, for the most part, were helping others out.
Yeah, no, I think that's totally right. And I guess so. Let's talk about the response there a little bit. So what happens is the response is always slower than other places, and in this case, you had a couple things going for you. You had the fact that people there were experienced with earthquakes, right? You'd felt sort of shakes before, nothing as strong as this since 1906, but people sort of knew what to do. And we had all these kind of there's a construction worker on Interstate 880 who spent 2 hours pulling somebody from a crushed car. You had firefighters pulling people out of crushed apartments. But the other thing to note is that Hurricane Hugo happened about 4 or 5 months before this. So Hurricane Hugo was a really big hurricane that hit the Caribbean and also went into the Carolinas. And the thing about Hurricane Hugo was that the FEMA response was not awesome. I mean, it really sucked. The governmental response was uncoordinated and was widely deemed a failure. So the benefit that the people in the Bay Area had was that FEMA had like something to prove. Right. Which is always, there's like this cycle where people forget and then the response sort of sucks and then something happens and it's really bad and then the people wake up and they try and do better. Yeah. And so this earthquake was one of those times when the federal assets anyway really tried to do better. So and I've never seen it happen this fast, within 15 hours of this happening, first there was a general FEMA mobilization, and they did a press release about what FEMA could or could not do, and they had assistance centers open there by the next day.
That's amazing. So
the next morning, they were already out doing damage assessments of the area, and then they did this series of when FEMA stands up, they do assistance centers. And the way these assistance centers always work, in my experience, is you go in and somebody explains to you how to use the form, and then you learn how to use the form, and then you go through this line, and it takes you like 4 hours. Right. It's like the DMV, but somebody just set it up yesterday.
Right.
But what they did for this earthquake was and imagine this, it's crazy. They got a gym and a projector, and then they would bring like 400 people in at a time, and they would teach them all at the same time how to fill out the form, and then they would all fill out the form, and then they would process them through really, really fast because then they knew how to do it. And so they were able to process like tens of thousands of these applications for things incredibly fast.
That's amazing, especially because this was a spontaneous disaster. I mean, they weren't pre-deployed for this. To have that up and running that's amazing.
And here's the other thing, that this will be, especially for like what you're doing, 2 months before this, they did a big regional exercise about how to handle an earthquake.
There we go, regional exercises.
I know, right? They're awesome.
Shout out.
And so that happened. The other thing that happened is, and how often does this happen? So Vice President J. Danforth Quayle, and by the way, who knew? Who knew that was his name, right?
Yeah.
And also, what does the J stand for?
J.
What's worse than Danforth?
Yeah, really. Juniper.
He got there the day after the quake.
Wow.
So this is the day of the quake. The next day, Dan Quayle shows up. 2 days later, the president shows up.
Wow.
Just like that. Now, part of that is because it was, I guess, on national television and everybody saw it happen because it was the World Series. But, I mean, all of that stuff was amazing. That was great. It was good news, which is good because here's one more clip about what was happening.
911 emergency.
Yes, have you gotten word about the Bay Bridge?
What about the Bay Bridge? What's wrong with it?
The deck appears to have collapsed during the earthquake.
Jesus Christ.
The magnitude of Loma Prieta was a 6.9, but that's a strong earthquake.
Oh my God, we're having an earthquake. Wait a minute. Hold on. There go the lights. Oh.
I'm an earthquake geologist. I've been doing this work for 40 years, and my first thought was, are they going to continue the game? I'm a big A's fan.
He's got his priorities right.
I know, right?
Which they did not. They continued the series, but just not that game.
Yeah. What actually happened with that?
I think they waited like 2-3 days and then went back to it. I actually don't remember if they did it in the stadium though. I want to say they did like rapid repairs and got it. But that was another fascinating thing about this series is like a year or two before they had retrofitted the stadium, done all these emergency repairs to it because it was an old stadium that they think now, looking back, saved thousands of lives because the upper part of the stadium didn't collapse. And you heard the player talk about looking up and seeing, like, it looked like the crowd was doing the wave, but it was actually the earthquake going through the stadium, which is just like an unbelievable thing to witness. But that stadium held up. Wow. But if they hadn't have done those repairs, like, who knows what would have happened. They also had the story of this like good old boy who was like a worker that was up on one of the light stands when the thing hit, and he was like swaying back and forth like 50 feet. This thing was, and he thought he was gone. He thought he was going to get thrown off of there, and he hung on and survived. And they like talked to him after.
Oh, I remember. Yeah, he was like,
they talked to him modern
about
day,
like his like euphoria. You know, he's like, I felt like I was gonna die, and then I didn't die, and that was amazing.
I mean, he's like, it's like going through war or something. He had this euphoria, like I had cheated death, and now I have, I'm indestructible.
So just shout out to Rebecca Solnit, who's my favorite author on these things, who talks about that euphoria and how it becomes this kind of sense of community. So in the initial response, that sense of community was there, and it seemed like FEMA was on the ground. And then 3 things happened that were bad, that really got in the way of the response. So thing 1 was that, they'd done this regional response, the state and the county folks and the feds, and it helped them to get these initial kind of big ticket things in place, the insurance claims and all that stuff. But the problem was the way that California is organized, there are so many local governments, all kinds of villages and towns and cities that are right next to each other, and they weren't involved, and they didn't know how to get involved.
Because why would you want to include the locals in a regional exercise?
Right, exactly. It seems ridiculous. But because they weren't involved, they were the ones talking to the residents, they would talk to the residents, and they didn't know what to do, so they called FEMA directly. And FEMA said, look, we can't help you. You've got to go through a county, through a state to talk to us. And the locals didn't know how to talk to the county because they never exercised with the county. Right. So they would call FEMA, think they had requested something, think it was going through, but it wasn't because they hadn't followed the process right. That was problem 1. Problem 2 was, and to do this, you have to imagine a map of Oakland, California in your brain. So if you can't do that, just imagine a rectangle. Okay, if you got the rectangle, in the top left-hand corner of the rectangle is San Francisco Bay.
Okay.
And then there's this cluster of highways, and along the edge of the bay is I-880, which is where the section of I-880 collapsed. Okay. And then a little to the right of that is this thing that's the Cypress Freeway. Now it's called the Mandela Parkway, but at the time, this was the double-decker one, the one that pancaked on top of each other. Okay, so here's the thing about the Cypress Freeway that you should know is to the left of the Cypress Freeway, which was one of those things like, I always think of the Matrix, like a walled-off freeway that you can't get past, you can't see around. It to the left of it was the Marina District, which was an old-school, pretty rich neighborhood on the bay, waterfront, you know what I mean, old money kind of a place. To the right of it was West Oakland, and 2 weeks before this happened in West Oakland, Huey Newton was gunned down in a crack deal, right? So it's a different, and it was this freeway that divided them.
Yeah.
And so what happened after the earthquake was that the response divided along that pancaked freeway. Because to the right, there were a lot of Spanish speakers, there were a lot of other language issues and cultural barriers. And to the right, to the left of it, people had insurance, they had resources, and they sort of had social cohesion enough to put the life back together. So when the media came in and the media started saying sort of, look, FEMA sucks, they sucked after Hugo, they're going to suck now, even though at that time, against all odds, FEMA wasn't actually sucking, they were doing a great job. The people in West Oakland, because they weren't being reached out to appropriately because of language barriers, because they didn't have resources to sort of navigate all this stuff, felt really left out of the response. And so they became really dissatisfied, and it became this real class distinction between the left side and the right side of that freeway. So much so that later on, Oakland fought with the California Department of Transportation for something like a decade to actually get rid of that freeway and turn it into a parkway so it wouldn't divide up the neighborhoods anymore.
That's amazing.
It really, and it to me, that's a real, like when you talk about twin studies or how disasters affect different neighborhoods in different ways, those two neighborhoods very close together, similar impacts, really different outcomes.
Or just also like how the built environment affects not only disaster preparedness, but disaster recovery. That'd be an interesting thing to look at. It always amazed me that they built these double-decker freeways in an earthquake-prone area, right?
Yeah, whose idea
Even
was
as
that?
a kid, I remember thinking like, probably not a good idea.
Yeah.
Like,
how did they get away with that?
Because like, why would they do that?
You know, I was in San Francisco just on a trip, and they have like they have a science museum there, and it had like an earthquake house that you go into, and it sort of shakes you for different earthquakes. Nice. And I remember it was so unnerving going through it, and this earthquake lasted for 17 seconds, which seems incredibly short, but like that length of time is enough to wreak just like tremendous structural havoc. And especially that section of the Cypress Freeway was built on landfill, right? It was built on filled earth, and so
so it's not stable to begin with, or at least once it starts shaking, all that stuff starts settling and it causes more sway.
Right. It has liquefaction. That's a great earthquake word. The soil liquefacts and it all falls through there.
But this is just like an amazing TV show. So if you, I mean, I love all the 30 for 30s, but to get one that's like disaster related, it's like awesome.
It's like double mint gum.
It's amazing.
And both of those, I just want to know both of those neighborhoods, West Oakland and the Marina District. There's a great article about them in the San Francisco Gate newspaper, just saying sort of how this affected them and how they have been able to sort of build back and become really vibrant communities. And the Mandela Parkway, actually, obviously named after Nelson Mandela, it has a number of parks along the corridor, and it is sort of a greenway that people use as a recreation area.
That great San Franciscan Nelson Mandela.
Oh, that's right. Lived in the Castro district.
That's right.
Really
crazy cat.
Intense in the 70s. I think he was part of that.
Hyde-Ashbury.
Yeah, he was really 70s flower child.
Right.
Nelson Mandela.
So just as a footnote on this, the earthmagazine.org ran an article that posing the question, what if the big one is just a series of kind of big ones? And it looks at data between 1690 and 1776 that a cluster of small earthquakes equaled the same power, energy that happens throughout the Bay Area in the 1905 earthquake. And so what they're thinking now, and even this show ends with like, oh, we haven't had another big one yet. Everybody's thinking the other big one was coming. They're kind of proposing now, what if, every 5 years or so we get a 6.8 to 7.2, and that kind of releases, those combined every 5 years releases the amount of energy that you would have in 1905. So my question to you, good sir, is would you rather live through / respond to a 9.7 on the Richter scale earthquake
9.7
every 20 years?
Jeez.
Or every 5 years have to deal with a 6.8?
Wow.
And you don't know when it's not like you can prepare for the 20-year one.
Right.
You don't know when it's coming.
Hold on a second.
Welcome to Serial.
I'm just buying time. This is a collect call from. I think that I would. So here's the thing. I think that a 6.8 every 5 years is easier to mitigate, right? I think if the city would build up, they would learn from it, right? So fewer people would die. So I think from a social perspective, that's much better. On the other hand, for myself, purely selfishly, I would rather do a 9.8 every 20 years because I would have a good 10 years to rest in between
which you would need.
And then when they happened, it would be incredibly dramatic.
That's true.
Yeah, but that's a really heartless, cold way to look at that.
I know. You think about it with other emergencies, like here in this region, we probably have every 5 years we have a couple of hurricanes. But I don't know. Those aren't really fun to go through.
One hurricane in the last 70 years. Right, the one
have
before Sandy.
Well,
there's Irene.
Tropical storms. And
okay,
maybe nor'easters.
All right,
every year we get nor'easters that screw things up, cause flooding. But I think I would rather have those smaller ones every couple years that are going to happen. You can plan for them than a huge one that just cripples the city.
I think that's fair. The thing about New York City is Do you know how many buildings we have in New York City that are unreinforced? I messed up that cue.
You can tell this is our first one back for a while because we're like hitting.
I have an itchy trigger finger. I'm gonna try that punchline again.
Wait,
ready?
so do I know how many?
No, hold on. I'm gonna ask you a question.
Okay.
I'm gonna be real smooth.
Take two.
So, do you know in New York City how many buildings we have that are unreinforced masonry that would just immediately collapse in any kind of an earthquake?
Like the actual number or like percentage?
What the actual number is?
Can I do percentage? Actual number, like what's the? I don't know the like denominator. What's the?
Okay, fine. We have there are, I think, 1,200,000 structures in New York City.
In the structures, so I would say how many are unreinforced masonry?
Yeah.
5,000.
Oh, really? All you're trying to do is ruin my. You're trying to ruin my punchline.
I don't know.
All right. The answer is in New York City we have 200,000 buildings that are unreinforced masonry.
Oh my gosh, that's scary.
And would collapse in an earthquake.
We need to follow LA's example on that. They're making their unreinforced building owners like retrofit their buildings.
Really? I don't think
At
we
least
can pull
that's
it
the
off.
plan.
We're not tough enough to make building. But we did 1995 building code in New York City did reinforce that for new stuff.
Oh yeah.
But yeah, I just
that's crazy.
It is really frightening.
You can take my unreinforced masonry when you can pry it out of my cold dead hands.
That's exactly right.
All right.
Yep.
So the next big disaster we're going to cover is the Sony Cyberattack.
Aaron Sorkin says we can't talk about that. I just want to be clear.
So this is kind of frustrating. So Sony gets, just to recap what happened, Sony gets hacked. They released a ton of emails. They released some movies out into the market. No one really claims to it, but the U.S. government recently has tracked it back to North Korea. North Korea is responsible for this, and they're really mad that this movie, The Interview, is coming out, which is about an actor and his agent who are going on, and they're sent on a mission to assassinate the leader Kim Jong-un.
You know what I was thinking is, one of our first episodes we reviewed This Is the End, which is the disaster movie of James Franco and stuff, and now they're actually causing a disaster.
I know, maybe this is all part of it.
It's like a whole meta thing where they actually called North Korea before this. They were like, so it'd be a cool publicity stunt.
Great marketing.
But let's talk about for a second how this actually happened. So the Monday before Thanksgiving, and this is from Washington Post and BBC reporting, Monday before Thanksgiving, Sony Pictures employees show up at work. They try to log into their computer, and what they get is this freaky graphic of a neon red skeleton that's like bouncing around, and it says #hacked by #GOP. And at first they think Mitch McConnell and John Boehner did this to their machines. But then it had links on it to this data of various kinds. And that would freak me out, right?
Yeah.
If that happened, especially because some of the stuff that was stolen was not just emails. People focus on it's also their bank accounts, like their
personal
information, direct deposit
information,
HR information was stolen.
And there's already been lawsuits too, right? Employees suing Sony because this information has been stolen.
Yeah.
So there's all sorts of ramifications coming from.
What do you think? So the Aaron Sorkin question is, all right, so there's a cyber attack. Now there's all this emails out. His point was, well, if you say what was in that email, then you're doing the same thing as the people that posted the naked pictures of Jennifer Lawrence on the internet that were stolen from him, because that information is it's stolen property. So you're illegally reporting it. You know what I mean?
Illegally reporting it or illegally
reporting it, like if I said,
oh, I see.
If
I
said
reporter,
right now
yeah,
that I know
gotcha.
Angelina Jolie is a spoiled, talentless brat because I saw it in an email from Sony, that I'm being un-American.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It's kind of the same as watching one of the movies that has been stolen and released. I think Annie was one of the movies that was stolen. You're kind of buying stolen. It's like the equivalent of buying stolen goods.
Yeah, I've watched Annie a dozen times.
You have?
Yeah,
on BitTorrent.
I know, over and over again. I can't stop.
Right. Yeah. Exactly. It's a great movie. So, yeah, I think I would agree with that. If you're partaking in things that have been stolen, you're contributing to the problem.
So the thing I wanted to talk about a little bit was the COOP implications of this. So in emergency management, we do this stuff called continuity of operations, and we abbreviate it COOP because we abbreviate everything. And it's about how you maintain core services in the face of an attack.
Otherwise,
like
in private
this.
sector, they call it business continuity.
Oh yeah, which is much easier to say than COOP. It's really it's better not to acronym things. But there's this great article in TechCrunch about how this one particular employee for Sony is dealing with it. So she's saying that she feels like they've dropped back to 1992, and even today, this really just came out yesterday. They have, in order to maintain their internal security, they haven't made their computers fully functional yet. They're still checking the system because they think that leftover code is still resident on the computers.
I'm sure,
so
yeah.
Sony Pictures is running, basically, they don't have voicemail. They don't have email except through certain systems. People have pulled out fax machines out of the closet, and they've had to turn printers on so that they can print checks out for people.
Oh my gosh.
I know. And they've released guidance on this stuff to get people's like bank accounts and stuff all back together. But the thing that's amazing is that she is saying that she and her coworkers are actually closer now, because they're only communicating face-to-face. So it's the same Rebecca Solnit thing. They've all sort of bonded together in the face of this
going through this
adversity. Yeah,
that's crazy. I know that some companies I've worked with have had, part of their COOP continuity of operations plan is to process checks manually, and so like part of their training every year is like, all right, guys, if we don't have the computers and have to make payroll, how are we going to do that? And they actually like practice doing checks and manually recording funds. It's crazy that we have to do this. The other thing, I heard an interview with Mark Cuban, who's the owner of Dallas Mavericks, billionaire. He says he doesn't do anything important over email for exactly this reason.
Yeah.
Because it's, I'm sure he's a target. He's probably been tried to get hacked before, but he doesn't do anything important over email. It also makes me think of military bases, facilities with top secret clearance. All those computers aren't connected to the internet. There's usually like one terminal within the building that has internet access that's not connected at all to the network, for these type of reasons. And it makes me wonder what role email will have in the future, even for companies, organizations that don't deal with secret.
Yeah, it's really just for like formal memos, right? That's what email's best for, is just something that everybody's agreeing on,
Right.
So I think that makes sense. Admiral Adama worked for Admiral Adama, right? Battlestar Galactica,
that's right.
Not connected via network to the rest of the system.
The rest of it, yeah.
And that's why they survived. The thing to note too here are it was old hardware that hadn't been backed up in a decade or something like that. Which was a little amazing. And she was actually doing the interview on her own personal iPhone for this TechCrunch article because, she still didn't have a working phone. I know. So, but it's amazing how many, when you hear the reporting on this stuff, it's all about, ooh, this person called this person this name and here's the leak stuff. But there's this entire system of stuff working behind it to try and put it back together.
What do you think about Sony pulling the picture?
I'm with Rob Lowe.
I am too. I retweeted him, which my wife made fun of me for.
Oh, really?
I was like, it's worth it. He's making a good point. Because he was like, the terrorists have won. The hackers have won, I think is what he said.
Right.
But I feel like they have.
We'll never get to see the interview. We'll never get to review it on this program.
I mean, surely they're going to release it in some form down the road, right?
Yeah, I guess so.
But I think they get insurance money for it. Like since they're not able to release it, they get kind of insurance.
But James Franco's got to be crying now. He's like in his room surrounded by his own artworks and his performance art pieces, and he's like bald and crying on his bed.
Yeah, poor guy. I feel so sorry for him.
I don't know.
Life that
it
guy
really
has.
I feel like they should release it.
But also, why wasn't Team America? Why didn't they forget about that?
Which is much worse. It must be much worse.
Do they even know about it, I wonder? That makes serious fun.
They did, but that was his dad. Maybe his dad was just more secure.
And it also, they used puppets, so maybe they thought it was like a kid's movie.
Yeah, it's okay if it's puppets. That's your answer, is in the future, commit disaster cyber attacks using puppets.
How crazy is it, though, that they did that North Korea got so mad about a movie that they did? I mean, it just seems like, are they a little sensitive?
We're all a little sensitive.
I guess so. All right, that about does it for this episode. Appreciate your patience with us as we get back into the groove, but we did want to mention one last thing. Drones.
Oh my God, you can't stop talking about drones.
We can't have an episode without drones. Do you have the clip, the drone watch?
Oh my
right.
Gosh,
no, this is just embarrassing.
Do that. Oh yeah, here it is.
Drone watch.
There we go. All right, drone watch. So the only thing we wanted to mention is that MIT has developed underwater drones. Are you kidding me? Originally, these guys were designed to look for cracks in like nuclear reactor or water tanks. But they're saying now, they can also inspect ships for holes and propeller shafts. They could hide them in algae and like coral reefs, and then they all like spontaneously attack a smuggler that's coming in. So I'm just like, at this point, we're pretty sure drones are going to take over the world someday, right? I think that's.
Oh my God!
Just because I forgot to do the other one before I'm balancing out.
Yeah,
I
think it's just a given at this point.
It's the Christmas of drones, right? And I want a drone for Christmas. Jordan won't let me have a drone, though. But we should get a Dukes of Hazzard drone.
That would be great.
And we should fly it over Prospect Park and advertise ourselves.
Orange with Confederate flags hanging off of it. Again, goes over really well. All right, I think that's it.
Crazy, yeah.
Now we're just playing. We're just mashing the keyboard, playing as many sounds as we can.
All right, so listen to us, email us.
Yeah, write us a review on iTunes. Follow us on Twitter, Hazards Podcast @Hazards Podcast. What else?
Make sure you retweet us and. Send us your story ideas, or if you have questions, send it to us. I'm going to say this, I was really fascinated by Serial, and I love the idea of doing one disaster over several podcasts, like digging into a disaster and the twists and turns of it and making it into a long form thing.
That'd be fascinating. I feel like that would require so much work.
Yeah, that's right.
Which obviously we don't put into this podcast.
Sarah Koenig, Serial Season 2, call us.
Here we go. But thanks for listening. Email suggestions. And we'll see you next time.
We won't see them because it's a podcast. We'll
talk to you next time.
You'll hear us next time.